Hi. I'm going to introduce Daniel. I wrote a little piece. I met Daniel Kehlmann about 20 years ago at a literary festival in Florence. We were boarding the kind of stuffy bus literary festivals use to chaperone a dozen writers a couple of hundred yards from one panel event to the next, unless their delicate literary knees give out under the strain of walking on cobblestones. And like school children, we were sat down in single-file rows, English writers, French writers, German writers, Italian writers, all equally eager to avoid cross-continental communication, as I remember. And the back of Daniel's head was in my face. And nothing I'd heard about him up to that point made me especially keen for him to turn round. A 24-year-old Austro-German literary wunderkind who had recently written a best-selling novel I hadn't yet read, but which I happen to know featured as characters the German mathematician Gauss, the German geographer Humboldt, and the German analytic philosopher Immanuel Kant. I have to admit I didn't forecast a barrel of laughs. If my English education taught me anything, it was that you did not look to the cultural products of Germany for anything resembling a good time. An improving time, certainly, and a challenging time, usually, but a good time? I can remember frantically trying to piece together what I remembered about the categorical imperative in case I found myself in some kind of Anglo-German wunderkind standoff. But imagine my surprise then when a cheery-faced individual, exactly 11 months older than I, swiveled round in his seat and cried, "Well, isn't this funny?" And it was funny. Like all literary festivals, it was patently ridiculous. But he was also very funny, full of good humor and erudition lightly worn, and with a great interest in absolutely everything. I can remember that we did talk about Kant, not the terrifying Kant of the Critique of Pure Reason, but the aged, babbling, senile Kant with whom Daniel has such fun in his masterful debut, Measuring the World. And we talked about the oddity of our new lives as baby writers. We laughed at the stupidity of panels, where 6 people take an hour to say what might have been said by one person in 5 minutes. And we laughed at the oddity of German literary events, where actors read the novel aloud and the reading lasts a minimum of an hour, and the audience gives a strong impression they wouldn't mind it going on for another 4. I remember he was amused at the tradition of Italian introductions, where the introducer of the novelist is introduced by a previous introducer, who's themselves introduced by 3 more pre-introducers, one of whom is almost always the mayor. But mostly, as I remember it, we talked about Nabokov. In the Venn diagram of our wildly different literary backgrounds, this was our shared area, that part of both of us that revels in puns, linguistic games, codes and decoding, magic and logic, the sublime and the ridiculous. But discussing Nabokov with Daniel, I realized I was being comprehensively out-wunderkinded. I admire Nabokov a great deal, but I'm not at all like him. Only one of my hemisphere of my brain works. I can't add up numbers, I don't understand even the most basic scientific concepts, and I treat all philosophy I read as essentially an outpost of poetry. But not so with Daniel. He is a writer with the full complement of talents, creative and logical, poetic and rational, both hedgehog and fox. The unusual combination of logician and artist in him can be seen to find a unity in his fascination with magic and magicians, a theme that makes an appearance in almost everything he's written, including Tyll. What is magic exactly? A logical game, the rules of which are hidden, that yet produces the illusion of the impossible. It's also a good description of Daniel's novels, which bury great complexity of thought, argument, and research to produce the illusion of something light as a soap bubble, as fully formed as a religious vision, and miraculously perfected by an unseen hand. When I read a novel by Daniel, I experience exactly the same childlike awe that comes over me at a magic show. How did he do that? Where are the hidden levers and pulleys? How did he make this come and this go, this thing fast and this one slow? Most novels I find I can reverse engineer in my mind, but never Daniel's. And this is true even though of all the writers I know, except perhaps my husband, I'm a more intimate witness to Daniel's process than any other. This is primarily because 20 years after we first met, we now find ourselves living next door to each other in New York. For the 5 years it took to write Tyll, I regularly saw Daniel in the playground, valiantly pretending to look after his son Oscar while actually reading a 400-page book about some obscure aspect of the already obscure 30 Years' War. And over those years, we often discussed this research, the ideas in the book, the idea of historical novels in general, and the fact that it was very likely that writing this book would kill Daniel before he ever published it. So I saw firsthand the sweat and the work and the sacrifice. But when I read Tyll in manuscript last summer, I was once again confronted with an act of pure transubstantiation. For all that blood, sweat, and tears that went into Tyll are entirely invisible. There's no evidence of 5 years' worth of laborious reading in dusty archives. Nor would you ever know a young child had been left to push himself in a swing for months on end so that this enchanting historical confection could be completed. I know, because he's my friend, that it's Daniel who lays the tablecloth with all the fine dining things on it, and Daniel who whisks the tablecloth away, leaving the plates and glasses and the little vase with a rose in it, just where it stands. But I have no idea how he does it. And in 20 years of friendship, I've never really asked him, usually because we're surrounded by children and they're screaming and making all conversation impossible. So tonight, in this child-free zone, I thought I might use the opportunity, if you'll indulge me, to find out. But first, let me introduce you to my remarkable friend, toast of Germany, pride of Europe, and gift to America, Daniel Kehlmann. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm going to read most of the first chapter of Tyll, which has the advantage that I don't have to explain anything because it's the first chapter. So it's kind of self-explanatory. And the chapter is called Shoes. The war had not yet come to us. We lived in fear and hope and tried not to draw God's wrath down upon our securely walled town with its 105 houses and the church and the cemetery where our ancestors waited for the day of resurrection. We prayed often to keep the war away. We prayed to the Almighty and to the kind Virgin. We prayed to the Lady of the Forest and to the little people of midnight, to St. Gervin, to Peter the gatekeeper, to John the evangelist. And to be safe, we also prayed to old Mela, who during the 12 nights when the demons are let loose roams the heavens at the head of her retinue. We prayed to the horned ones of ancient days and to Bishop Martin, who shared his cloak with the beggar when the latter was freezing, so that they were then both freezing and pleasing to God, for what's the use of half a cloak in winter? And of course we prayed to St. Maurice, who had chosen death with a whole legion rather than betray his faith in the one just God. Twice a year, the tax collector came and always seemed surprised that we were still here. Now and then merchants came, but since we didn't buy much, they soon went on their way, which was all right with us. We needed nothing from the wide world and gave it no thought until one morning a covered wagon, pulled by a donkey, rolled down our main street. It was a Sunday at the beginning of spring. The stream was swollen with meltwater, and in those fields that weren't lying fallow, we had sown the seed. A red canvas tent was pitched on the wagon. In front of it crouched an old woman. Her body looked like a bag. Her face seemed made of leather. Her eyes looked like tiny black buttons. A younger woman with freckles and dark hair stood behind her. But on the coach box sat a man we recognized, even though he had never been here before. And when the first of us realized who he was and called his name, others too realized, and soon many voices were calling from all directions, "Tyll is here! Tyll has come! Look, it's Tyll!" It could be no one else. Leaflets came, even to us. They came through the forest. The wind carried them, merchants brought them. Out in the world, more of them were printed than anyone could count. They were about the ship of fools, and the great priestly folly, and the evil pope in Rome, and the devilish Martinus Luther of Wittenberg, and the sorcerer Horridus, and Dr. Faust, and the hero Gawain of the Round Table, and indeed about him, Tyll Eulenspiegel, who had now come to us himself. We knew his pied jerkin, we knew the battered hood and the calfskin cloak. We knew the gaunt face, the small eyes, the hollow cheeks and the buck teeth. His breeches were made of good material, his shoes of fine leather, but his hands were a thief's or a scribe's hands which had never done work. His right held the reins, his left the whip. His eyes flashed as he greeted this person and that. "And what's your name?" he asked a little girl. She was speechless, unable to fathom that a person of such renown should be addressing her. "Well, tell me." When she stammered that her name was Martha, he only smiled as if he had always known it. Then he asked intently, "And how old are you?" She cleared her throat and told him. In the 12 years of her life, she had not seen eyes like his. There might be eyes like these in the free cities of the empire and at the great courts, but never before had anyone with such eyes come to us. Martha hadn't known that such strength, such agility of the soul could speak from a human face. One day she would tell her husband, and then much later her incredulous grandchildren, who would consider Eulenspiegel a figure of old legends, that she had once seen him in the flesh. In the meantime, the wagon had rolled by and his gaze had glided elsewhere to others on the roadside. Again, there were shouts of "Tyll has come" along the street, and "Tyll is here" from the windows, and "It's Tyll" from the church square onto which his wagon now rolled. He cracked the whip and stood up. With lightning speed, the wagon turned into a stage. The two women folded the tent. The young one tied her hair into a knot, put on a little crown, and threw a piece of purple cloth around her, while the old one stood in front of the wagon and began to sing droningly. Her dialect had the sound of the south, of the big cities of Bavaria, and wasn't easy to understand, but we did glean that the song was about a woman and a man who loved each other and were cruelly separated by a body of water. Till Eulenspiegel took a blue sheet, kneeled down, flung it, holding on to one end, away from him so that it unfurled with a crackle. He pulled it back and flung it away again, pulled it back, flung it, and the way he kneeled on one end and the woman on the other, and the blue billowed between them, there really seemed to be water there, and the waves went up and down so furiously that it seemed no ship could sail them. When the woman straightened up and looked at the waves, her face rigid with fright, we suddenly noticed how beautiful she was. As she stood there and stretched her arms toward the sky, she all at once no longer belonged here, and none of us could look away. Only out of the corner of our eyes did we see her beloved leaping and dancing and bustling around and brandishing his sword and battling dragons and foes and witches and evil kings on the difficult journey to her. The play lasted into the afternoon. So I'm going to skip a few pages now and go to the end of the play. He put down the flute, stood up, spread his arms and asked for payment and food. Because now there would be a pause, and the best would come if we slipped him good money thereafter. Martha walked slowly around the covered wagon. There sat Tyll Eulenspiegel, leaning his back against the wagon wheel and drinking from a large stein. Next to him stood a donkey. "Come here," he said. Her heart pounding, she stepped closer. He held out the stein to her. "Drink," he said. She took the stein. The beer tasted bitter and heavy. "The people here, are they good people?" She nodded. "Peaceful people, help each other, understand each other, like each other. Is that the sort of people they are?" She took another sip. "Yes." "Well then," he said. "We'll see," said the donkey. In her fright, Martha dropped the stein. "The precious beer," said the donkey. "You damned stupid child." "It's called ventriloquism," said Tyll Eulenspiegel. "You can learn it too if you like." "You can learn it too," said the donkey. Martha picked up the stein and took a step back. The puddle of beer grew and then shrank again, the dry ground soaking up the wetness. "Seriously," he said, "come with us. You know me now. I'm Tyll. My sister over there is Nele. She's not my sister. The name of the old woman, I don't know. The donkey is the donkey. Martha stared at him. We'll teach you everything, said the donkey. Nele and the old woman and Tyll and I. And you'll get away from here. The world is big. You can see it. I'm not just called donkey. I have a name too. I'm Origenes. But why are you two asking me? Because you're not like them, said Tyll Eulenspiegel. You're like us. Martha held out the stein to him, but he didn't take it, so she put it on the ground. Her heart was pounding. She thought of her parents and her sister, and the house in which she lived, and the hills out beyond the forest, and the sound of the wind in the trees, which she couldn't imagine sounded quite the same anywhere else. And she thought of her mother's stew. The famous man's eyes flashed as he said with a smile, think of the old saying, you can find something better than death everywhere. Martha shook her head. Very well then, he said. She waited, but he said nothing more, and it took her a moment to realize that his interest in her had already died away. And so she walked back around the wagon and to the people she knew, to us. We were her life now. There was no longer any other life for her. She sat down on the ground. She felt empty, but when we looked up, she did too, for we had all noticed at the same time that something was hanging in the sky. A black line cut through the blue. We squinted. It was a rope. On one side, it was tied to the window grill of the church tower, on the other to a flagpole jutting out of the wall next to the window of the town hall where the reef worked. A sparrow landed on it, took a small jump, spread its wings, changed its mind, and stayed perched there. Then Tyll Eulenspiegel appeared in the church tower window. He waved, jumped onto the windowsill, stepped onto the rope. He did it as if it were nothing. He did it as if it were only a step like any other. None of us spoke, none shouted, none moved. We had stopped breathing. He neither teetered nor tried to find his balance. He simply walked. His arms swinging, he walked the way you walk on the ground, except it looked a bit mincing how he always set one foot precisely in front of the other. You had to look closely to notice how he absorbed the swaying of the rope with small movements of his hips. He took a leap and bent his knees for only a moment when he landed. Then he strolled, his hands folded behind his back, to the middle. The sparrow took off, but it only beat its wings a few times and perched again and turned its head, always so quiet that we could hear it cheeping and peeping. And of course we heard our cows. Above us, Tyll Eulenspiegel turned slowly and carelessly, not like someone in danger, but like someone looking around with curiosity. He stood with his right foot lengthwise on the rope, his left crosswise, his knees slightly bent and his fists on his hips. And all of us, looking up, suddenly understood what lightness was. We understood what life could be like for someone who really did whatever he wanted, who believed in nothing and obeyed no one. We understood what it would be like to be such a person, and we understood that we would never be such people. Take off your shoes. We didn't know whether we had heard him correctly. Take them off, he shouted. Everyone, your right shoe. Don't ask, do it. It will be a lark. Trust me, take them off. Old and young, woman and man, everyone, your right shoe. We stared at him. Haven't you been enjoying it so far? Don't you want more? I'll show you more. Take off your shoes, everyone. Your right shoe, go on. It took us a while to get moving. That's how it always is with us. We are unhurried people. The first to obey was the baker, followed by Malte Schopf, and then Karl Lamm, and then his wife, and then the craftsman, who always thought they were better than everyone else, obeyed, and then we all did, every one of us, with the exception of Martha. Tine Krugman, next to her, nudged her and pointed to her right foot, but Martha shook her head, and Till Ullenspiegel on the rope took another leap, striking his feet together in the air. He jumped so high that he had to spread his arms when he landed to find his balance. Only very briefly, but it was enough to remind us that even he had weight and couldn't fly. And now, throw, he cried with a high, clear voice. Don't think, don't ask, don't hesitate. This will be a great lark. Do what I say, throw. Tine Krugman was the first to do it. Her shoe flew, rising higher and disappearing in the crowd. Then the next shoe flew. It was Susanne Schopf's, and then the next, and then dozens flew, and then even more and more and more. We all laughed and screamed and shouted, "Watch out," and "Duck," and "Heads up." It was terrific entertainment, and it didn't matter that some of the shoes hit people's heads. Curses rang out, a few women scolded, a few children wept, but it wasn't bad, and Martha even had to laugh when a heavy leather boot only barely missed her, while a woven slipper sailed through the air to land at her feet. He had been right, and some even found it so exhilarating that they threw their left shoes too. And some also threw hats and spoons and jugs which shattered somewhere, and of course a few threw stones too. But when his voice spoke to us, the noise faded away, and we listened. "You idiots." We squinted. The sun was low in the sky. Those at the back of the square could see him clearly, while for the rest he was only a silhouette. "You half-wits, you crumpheads, you tadpoles, you good-for-nothing beetle-brained oafs. Now fetch them again." We stared. Or are you too stupid? Is the word fetch too much to penetrate your skulls? He let out a bleating laugh. The sparrow took off, soared over the roofs, was gone. We looked at each other. We had been derided, but then again his rude mockery was not so sharp that it couldn't have been meant in jest. He was famous after all. He could take that liberty. "Well, what is it?" he asked. "Don't you need them anymore? Don't you want them anymore? Don't you like them anymore? You dolts, fetch your shoes." Malte Schopf was the first. He had felt ill at ease the whole time, and so he now ran to where he thought his shoe had flown. He pushed people aside, forcing and jostling his way through the crowd, bending over and rooting around between their legs. On the other side of the square, Karl Schönknecht did the same, followed by Elsbeth, the widow of the smith. But old Lemke blocked her and shouted at her to be off. That was his daughter's shoe. Elsbeth, whose forehead was still hurting from being hit by a boot, shouted back that he was the one who should be off because she could certainly still recognize her own shoe. Lemke's daughter by no means had such beautifully embroidered shoes as she did. Whereupon old Lemke screamed at her to get out of his way and not to disparage his daughter, whereupon she in turn screamed that he was a stinking shoe thief. Here Lemke's son intervened. "I am warning you." At the same time, Lise Schoch and the miller's wife began to quarrel because their shoes really did look alike and their feet were the same size, and Karl Lammet, his brother-in-law, also exchanged loud words, and Martha suddenly grasped what was happening here, and she crouched on the ground and started to crawl. Above her, there was now shoving, rebuking, and jostling. A few who had found their shoes quickly slipped away, but among the rest of us, a rage broke out with the force of long pent-up grievance. The carpenter Moritz Blatt and the blacksmith Simon Kern pummeled each other so ferociously that someone who thought they were fighting over shoes could not have understood, since he would not have known that Moritz's wife had been promised to Simon as a child. Both were bleeding from nose and mouth. Both were panting like horses, and no one dared break them up. Lore Pilz and Elsa Kohlschmidt were locked in terrible combat too, but then they had hated each other for so long that even they had forgotten why. It was very well known, however, why the Semmler family and the people from the Grünanger house lashed out at each other. It was because of the disputed field and the unresolved inheritance that went back as far as the days of Prefect Peter, and also because of the Semmler daughter and her child, which was not her husband's, but Karl Schönknecht's. The rage spread like a fever. Wherever you looked, people were shrieking and punching, bodies were rolling, and now Martha turned her head and looked up. There he stood, laughing. Back arched, mouth wide, shoulders heaving. Only his feet stood steadily, and his hips swung with the swaying of the rope. It seemed to Martha as if she only had to look more carefully, then she would understand why he was so delighted. But then a man ran toward her and didn't see her, and his boot struck her chest, and her head hit the ground, and when she inhaled, it was as if needles were pricking her. She rolled onto her back. Rope and sky were empty, till Eulenspiegel was gone. She struggled to her feet. She hobbled past the brawling, rolling, biting, weeping, battering bodies, here and there, still recognizing their faces. She hobbled along the street, hunching her shoulders and bowing her head. But just as she reached her front door, she heard the rumble of the covered wagon behind her. She turned around. On the coach box sat the young woman he had called Nele. Next to her, the old woman crouched motionless. Why wasn't anyone stopping them? Why wasn't anyone following them? The wagon passed Martha. She stared after it. Soon it would be at the elm, then at the city gate, then gone. And now, when the wagon had almost reached the last houses, someone was running after it with effortless long strides. The calf skin of the cloak bristled around his neck like something alive. "I would have taken you with me," he cried as he ran past Martha. Shortly before the bend of the street, he caught up with the wagon and jumped aboard. The gatekeeper was with the rest of us on the main square. No one held them back. Slowly, Martha went into the house, closed the door behind her and bolted it. The billy goat was lying next to the stove and looked up at her questioningly. She heard the cows bellowing, and our shouting rang out from the square. In the end, we recovered our tempers. The cows were milked before sundown. Martha's mother came back, and besides a few scratches, not much had happened to her. Her father had lost a tooth, and his ear was torn. Someone had stepped on her sister's foot so hard that she limped for a few weeks. But the next morning and the next evening came, and life went on. In every house, there were bumps and cuts and scratches and sprained arms and missing teeth. But by the next day, the main square was clean again, and we all were wearing our shoes. We never spoke about what had happened, nor did we speak about Eulenspiegel. Without having arranged it, we stuck to this. Even Hans Semmler, who was so severely injured that from now on he was confined to his bed and could eat nothing but thick soup, pretended it had never been otherwise. And even the widow of Karl Schönknecht, whom we buried the next day in the churchyard, acted as if it had been a blow of fate, and as if she didn't know exactly whose knife it had been in his back. Only the rope still hung for days over the square, trembled in the wind, and was a perch for sparrows and swallows, until the priest, who had been roughed up especially badly during the brawl because we didn't like his boastfulness and his condescension, could climb up the bell tower again to cut it down. At the same time, we didn't forget. What had happened remained between us. It was there while we brought in the harvest, and it was there when we bargained over our grain or assembled on Sunday for the Mass, where the priest had a new facial expression, half wonder and half fear. And it was there especially when we held celebrations on the square and when we looked at each other in the face while dancing. Then the air seemed heavier, the water different on our tongues, and the sky where the rope had hung not quite itself. It was a good year later, before the war came to us after all. One night, we heard whinnying, and then there were many voices laughing outside, and soon we heard the crash of doors being smashed in, and before we were even on the street, armed with useless pitchforks or knives, the flames were flickering. The soldiers were hungrier than usual and deeper in their cups. It had been a long time since they entered a town that offered them so much. Old Louise, who had been fast asleep and this time had no presentiment, died in her bed. The priest died standing protectively in front of the church portal. Lise Schoch died trying to conceal a stash of gold coins. The baker and the smith and old Lemke and Moritz Blatt and most of the other men died trying to protect their women. And the women died as women do in war. Martha died too. She saw the ceiling of the room turn into red heat above her. She smelled the thick smoke before it seized her so tightly that she could make out nothing more, and she heard her sister cry for help while the future that had a moment ago been hers dissolved. The husband she would never have, and the children she would never raise, and the grandchildren she would never tell about a famous jester one morning in spring, and the children of these grandchildren, all the people who now would not exist. That's how quickly it happens, she thought, as if she had penetrated a great secret. And as she heard the roof beams splintering, it occurred to her that Tyll Uhlenspiegel was now perhaps the only person who would remember our faces and would know that we had existed. Indeed, the only survivors were the lame Hans Semmler, whose house had not caught fire and who had been overlooked because he couldn't move, and Elsa Ziegler and Paul Grünanger, who had secretly been in the forest together. When they returned at dawn with rumpled clothes and disheveled hair and found nothing but rubble under curling smoke, they thought for a moment that the Lord God had punished them for their sin by sending them a mad vision. They moved west together, and for a brief time, they were happy. As for the rest of us, we can sometimes be heard here, where we once lived, in the trees. We can be heard in the grass and in the chirping of the crickets. We can be heard when you lean your head against the knothole of the old elm. And at times children think they see our faces in the water of the stream. Our church is no longer standing, but the pebbles polished round and white by the water are still the same, just as the trees are the same. We remember, even if no one remembers us because we have not yet reconciled ourselves to not being. Death is still new to us, and we are not indifferent to the things that concern the living. For it all happened not long ago. Thank you.
Hi. This is so weird. Hey, hi everyone. I can just about see you. I wanted to ask first about historical fiction in general, because when we were young, I remember we all both used to talk about how much we hated historical fiction and couldn't see the point in it. And whenever I read your historical novels, you've written a few, I realized it was the opposite of everything I hate about historical fiction. It's not in the voice of the period. It's not kind of obsessively teleological, only choosing events that seem relevant to the present. But I never understood how you would achieve the voice, like even hearing it there. How do you find in German a voice which is neutral enough to speak of the past without being, overly nostalgic or in the voice of a particular century? Or
I struggled with that quite a lot when I was working on Tyll, until I found out that it's really not about the voice. Right. It's about the concepts that you use. So, and I mean, that's of course more important in a novel set in early modernity in the 17th century than in a novel, let's say, set in the 19th century. But I tried a lot. I even tried for a little bit to emulate how people might have talked back then, but that's terrible.
It's impossible.
That's impossible, and no one wants to read that, and no one wants to write that.
Nobody wants to read it.
But it's about what I then came up with is a voice that is not concerned with using words that we would use,
Right.
not worried about using them, that is freely using them, but I'm trying to avoid all concepts that people back then didn't have.
Right.
And that's actually a lot, because our language and our way of thinking in everyday life is really full of ideas from psychology and
Right.
from physics, for example. When we say I'm depressed, that's not an idea they had.
Right.
When we say I don't have any energy today, they didn't have there's a lot of that, and I try to avoid everything they would not have understood in terms of concepts, but I don't care about the words.
But I think that's what I was getting at, that when I read it, I would think there's no psychology in here, but it's not true there's no interiority. People have plenty of feelings.
Yes. They just think about them a bit differently.
Yeah, the feelings are on a completely different scale and connected to different things. Like even the first lines of the book about the variety of prayer, that's how you might discuss like a variety of feelings you have or sentiments. That to them is an everyday practice.
And then it's
15
all
different gods.
And then it's all mixed, in a way. Christian ideas and pagan ideas are mixed in a way that for us is quite strange, but that to them was really normal. And the church was fighting that, but
Right.
I'm trying to use that mindset, and that's also the good thing because about being a novelist, and that's what interesting for me in writing historical novels, although I hate them, usually, not all of them,
Yes.
obviously, but which is historians, by definition and by method, are very careful about making certain judgment calls. So, for example, the question, did a much, much higher child mortality mean that people had a much colder, less loving relationship to their children? Just an example, when you read Philippe Ariès' seminal work, History of Childhood, he is very, very careful. He says, we really do not know, that's a judgment we cannot really make.
Right.
But I can, because I'm a novelist.
Yes.
So I'm
You have that
allowed to
freedom.
invent, and I actually think, yes, they had a much colder relationship to their children, so I can invent that, but I think it's true.
The Winter King had 13 children, right?
A lot, yeah.
3 died.
I
One
think,
drowning, one.
but those
one
were the ones
epilepsy.
that died as adults. I mean, there were more, I think, that died in infancy. That wasn't really counted.
Wow.
Yeah.
The other thing about the historical fiction, I was thinking about that line of James Wood in the essay he wrote in the New Yorker recently, is that what's strange about your historical fiction is the fidelity to the perspective of the characters.
Mm-hmm.
That's what always surprises me. And even what appears to be magic realism in your fiction, which to me magic realism often means anything can happen. In your novels, it's not quite that. It's more like anyone can believe anything and act upon that belief. And you take the belief seriously within the book.
Yes, and then of course, magic also works a little bit. Like in Tyll, people sometimes can get away by using the right spell at the right moment, but it's in a way, well, the thing is, because they believe they can, but then also because I felt when I was writing it, I felt so embedded in that worldview that it made sense to me to also make it work sometimes. I mean, it's not my worldview, it was my worldview for the purposes of writing that book, of course. I don't believe in magic.
I mean, I would...
Well, I don't. Usually I don't.
I was there watching you start it, and I remember thinking, this is a monumental task. Like, I sometimes write about things set in the past, and I find myself worrying about, practical matters, doorknobs, light switches, technical matters, but usually we're talking about a 45-year distance. When you told me you were doing it, my first thought was, how does a character enter a room?
Yeah.
How do they move through a field? How are you going to manage this? How do you deal with the physical environment in terms of your research?
I mean, that's something I realized with my other historical novel, with Measuring the World, that it was a huge help when I had a very hard time when I started writing it, describing a horse carriage.
Yeah, I remember that.
And
I remember that, yeah. Sorry, go on.
And because also those horse carriages, every 20 years, they changed a lot. They had different mechanisms, different wheels, and And then it was like a minor epiphany. I realized if this would be a modern novel and someone would use a car, I would also not describe the car.
Right.
And so I can just...
Right. It's a very good point.
Yeah, I can just treat the horse carriage as something that's normal for the characters, and that actually makes more sense than those infinitely long descriptions that you find in a certain kind of historical novels, which we don't like.
Right.
And so...
Swords and armor.
So the trick is to, or not, maybe not the trick, it's actually a good method, I think. People enter rooms because, well, they enter rooms the same way we enter a room, and there's no need to describe it in any way that to make it different, even if it was different, because they had other shoes, they had other kinds of greeting themselves, they were wearing different clothes.
Right.
They were not thinking about how they did that all the time. So I feel I don't have to do that. And then, of course, there are sometimes things that are kind of impossible to find out.
Right.
So, and those things you just don't mention.
Right.
So
That's a good principle.
So I had a very hard time finding out the mill. The whole first chapter, the second chapter is set in a mill.
Right.
What kind of glass, or if any, did a miller in rural Germany use in his mill? And there's a 3-volume history of daily life in modernity by a wonderful scholar, but he doesn't mention those windows.
You didn't read the whole thing in the hope
I did read the whole thing, but not for, that was very helpful, but not for the windows. And then so there's never any mention of the windows in the mill. And much later, after the book was published, I was invited to a dinner, and I was seated next to one of the eminent German historians of early modernity. And we were, because the host thought that we would have fun together, which we kind of had. German fun, right? Yeah. So we were talking about court etiquette and actually we were talking about whether the electors were actually equal to kings in the way they were treated in court etiquette, things like that.
Right.
And then I said, can I ask you about windows? In a mill, what would they have been made of?
This is a painful question because the book is finished.
Yes,
and
but
done.
I thought
it's like
I really wanted to know at this point.
Fine.
And he looked at me and said, we, meaning historians, we like to glide around questions like this. So the thing is, with some research, you realize how much there is that even the experts really don't know. That doesn't give you the license not to try to find out, but it does give you the license to be more relaxed about it.
Can you tell us a little bit about Tyll as he signifies in Germany? I mean, he's a pretty much unknown character, I think, in America.
In Germany, he's really close to being a household character, because he's somehow survived in... Initially, it's a collection of anecdotes from early 16th century, so much earlier.
That are scatological, isn't that right? There's a lot about,
a lot about, what do you mean?
I don't even know how to translate that into German, or nicely for the 19th century. Aren't they quite rude, generally, the anecdotes?
Yes. Yeah. They are, they were supposed to be very funny back then, and they're not anymore. I mean, humor ages usually not very well.
700 years of
they're
time
really very, usually they're brutal and extremely vulgar.
Right.
And most of these anecdotes just mean he will hurt someone and then run away, or kill a dog, or skin a dog that actually have stuff like that.
So he's a trickster, but he's quite malevolent. I mean, compared to a Nancy in Jamaica. Or
he's a malevolent trickster, and in a way he survived in children's books because somehow German children's book writers convinced themselves that those stories were didactic.
Right.
They thought he was teaching people their folly.
Right.
And I felt like that's not true. He's just really mean. And that's more interesting.
Well, the shoe anecdote, which is original to him, right?
Yeah.
And which is in the beginning of the novel.
That's an original anecdote, yeah.
We were discussing that backstage, like the actual significance of it, because it seems to be a man who is willing to throw everything in the air to cause trouble for no reason, to show people that they will fight over anything.
I think that's what it is. But the way there's a wonderful German writer who also wrote very much widely read children's books, Erich Kästner. And in his retelling of the story, which is how most people, including me, got to know that anecdote, he shows them their folly, which is also not entirely wrong, because it's stupid to get in such a fight about shoes. But I think that's less interesting. What's more interesting is that early modernity was when the process of civilization really got moving in a way. So people learned or were taught to not kill each other when they had, when they were angry at each other. They were taught themselves as a society not to defecate in front of their houses, but to go to the back of their houses. They were taught not to spit while they were eating these things. And kind of the fool, the jester, that's why those fool stories, there are many others in other national literatures, become so prominent in early modernity. The fool, the jester, is somehow the character who refuses to be part of that process of civilization.
Well, he's on the border, isn't he? The trickster is usually the person who reminds you that, you still take a shit. You still have needs. You're still an animal.
Yes.
He's right there reminding you that your civilization is thin, easily broken at any moment.
And all the things we force on ourselves and society forces on us, he refuses to do. So you never know what he's going to do next.
We were thinking backstage a little bit about Austrian culture, and I was thinking that a lot of the Austrian artists I admire have something in common with you, this sense of the thin veneer of civilization, that any moment something monstrous can emerge, for obvious historical reasons that there is a connection there.
It did emerge from Austria.
Yeah, and it did emerge from Austria. And even in that last scene of the first chapter, you feel this conflagration of violence that is absolute. But what I do think is unusual about you compared to people like Haneke and Jelinek is that with you, that thin veneer always has, the contemplation of it is always in some way laughter in the dark, that Nabokov line. It's never completely tragic or horrifying. There's always a kind of sense of absurdity behind the idea that civilization is thin and broken at any moment, not just for tragedy, but for ridicule.
Yeah.
And Tyll seems to be your perfect example of that obsession.
I mean, it is something that happens whenever I write. Things turn this is a war book, and it's quite dark, and really brutal things happen in it. But also, of course, it has the name of a famous jester. So in a way, it had to be a book that's also funny. Otherwise, even if he himself and his old stories are not funny anymore to us, he's kind of a Northern European patron saint of humor and of the resilience of humor. So I felt like it had to be a funny book. And that's also, of course, my temperament as a writer. So whatever I write, it turns out to be, it turns out something that I hope is at least sometimes funny.
It's always funny to me. Why, most people don't know that much about the 30 Years' War. I think the only thing I ever knew about it was the defenestration of Prague.
Yeah.
This incident where several people were thrown out of a window and the war started. That's about as much as most English students know about it. Why the 30 Years' War? What was it about it that, apart from the enormous amount of work you'd have to do to understand it, why did you choose it?
I'm still not sure I understand it as well as I want to, but I don't really know. It was strange because I got fascinated by the topic in 2012-13, which was in a very different world in many ways. Syria had the Syrian conflict was slowly starting, but had not yet blown up, and other things. I mean, the Western democracy were basically all of them seemed okay, and it
was pre-apocalypse.
Yes, it was, exactly.
But this novel is very, it feels as you're reading it, and obviously as contemporary readers you make these connections habitually, but it feels prophetic in that sense. To me, when I got interested in the topic of the wars of religion, of the complete meltdown of civilization, there was the 30 Years' War, it felt like just something that had no connection to the present. And I was fascinated by that. I liked that. I was not looking for a connection to the present. I was fascinated in the sheer otherness of that world. Same as I was interested in the sheer otherness of the pre-Enlightenment mind. Right.
And then I did have the weird experience while I was writing the book that the world I was living in and the world out there, and I mean the world I was living in and the world in my book, in the book I was working on, came closer and closer together in a way. And only then I thought there must be some logic, some to the fact that I wrote a playful comedy about Enlightenment thinkers in 2004, and that in 2014 I was busy writing a book about the meltdown of a civilization.
Right.
But I didn't intend for it to be timely. It just happened, but also I don't think it just happened. I must have felt something.
Well, the way that Tyll nudges people into chaos.
Yeah.
I mean, the shoe scene is like some kind of medieval Twitter explosion where people are being forced into a random fight over nothing. And the printing press analogy feels very strong throughout, that these leaflets that are coming to people for the first time with Protestant propaganda, Catholic propaganda, and they have absolutely no way of metabolizing that information or knowing this is a proper news source, this is nonsense, this is madness. All of that seems very familiar now.
Yes, and I mean, it is something that always happens when a new media, a new way of distributing information is introduced into the world. And that's why the fake news is nothing new. It just used to be called propaganda. And Europe in the 17th century was flooded with propaganda leaflets, with usually one page printed on one side, so and with the big pictures for people who couldn't read, and then some text, also often in verse form, towards the bottom of the leaf for people who could read. And it was an incredible amount of lies and disinformation from the Protestant side, from the Catholic side, from all political sides. And people after, like if you look at the world 100 years later, people had kind of learned to understand, as you said, what's a good source, what isn't. But it took a war.
That metabolization, like, you remember what Foucault says about authorship in terms of scientific papers and the kind of stuff we do. So once upon a time, creative stories, once upon a time, 17th century, a lot of creative stories would have been no point in having an author. It would have been considered a story that arises generally in the community, and who wrote it is neither here nor there, whereas a scientific paper had a name. And now it's the other way around, right? The author is the person who made this book, and a scientific paper can be made by a selection of people, but unless it's unique, it doesn't matter particularly what name is attached to it. But those kind of rules of authorship are what allowed people to separate the piece of propaganda from the place which comes from some authority.
And then structures of authority, like in the 18th century, people had learned, not everyone, not all the time, but had learned to recognize, for example, who was a good publishing house, or who's a good news source. It wasn't called publishing house yet, but it was booksellers printing their books, but some had authority, and you recognize this is serious, I can take this serious, and other things not. But people had to learn.
Right, each new medium explodes the idea of authority. Thinking of Orson Welles giving that radio presentation in the early days of radio. It sounded real, it sounded like authority, and that was enough to have people running from their houses. But what is the lesson then of Tyll in the 30 Years' War? How do you metabolize a medium as it washes over you and become sensible again?
I think the lesson is good and bad in a way. I mean, you could also compare it to the press, the newspapers before and after the First World War. The war propaganda in the newspapers on the British side, on the German side, on the French side was incredible and full of lies, and no newspaper people didn't feel like we shouldn't do that. And then those structures that we think are what defines a serious newspaper. Like you have to, there must be a distinction between commentary and op-ed and reporting, and of course ads. That established that's an invention that came to be after the First World War. So the thing, when we look at these things over the centuries, the good news is we do eventually learn it, how to deal with new media. The bad news is, in several cases, it took gigantic wars for us to learn it.
Yeah. On that subject of kind of historical optimism, we argue a lot about Pinker, Steven Pinker, and these ideas of the perfectibility of history.
Yeah.
And one of the great pleasures of this novel when you're reading it is you're such a pedant, if you don't mind me saying.
That's fine.
And when you get a historical fact where I would just sweep over it and make you drill down on it.
Yeah.
Daniel's very interested in, what is it like to have your leg amputated without any drugs? What was that like?
Yeah.
What is it like to have 4 children die out of 6? Yeah. I'm struck reading the novel again and again by the sheer monstrosity of daily existence at this moment. And yet I know that in your mind it turns towards this progressive argument that, we've never had it so good, etc.
I think it's not wrong.
But on that model, and it's in Tyll too, that you can only believe it if you believe the most important moral value is physical pain. But it might be also because we're complicated beings that meaning is one of the things we need more than anything else. An absence of meaning can be not, as you will say, having a leg cut off without anesthetic is more serious. But from the conflagrations we're seeing, absence of meaning has significant effect on people's lives.
I think there's this,
like a painful life might not have been one that is existentially disastrous, for
exactly.
example.
I mean, there is, I think that's something that Voltaire says about, I think about Pascal and the religious argument. He says, somewhere he says, that's all fine, but only as long as you don't get sick.
Right.
And he's talking about Pascal's wager, I think. And I think really, I think I agree with what you just said, though you meant it in a critical way, but I think it's really true. Nothing is of any value if you're in a lot of pain.
Right.
And so I really think the fact that we can live our lives and for long stretches of those lives not be in physical pain is something that most people throughout most of human history didn't have.
Right.
And that is just, I am happy to give any kind of religious meaning, to give that away for
have an amputation with
for
aesthetic,
a life where for a world where less people have are in less pain.
I do think reading Tyll is a kind of bracing reminder. We're both born in 1975, and I've often thought it since I started writing that our generation is almost unique in the history of the world. If you're born in the kind of well-fed democracies we were born into, in which even the daily experience of death is so distant. I'm now 44 and I have never seen a dead body. This must be an unprecedented event in human history.
Yeah.
What an extraordinary thing. In Tyll, on every page, there are hundreds of bodies. There are bodies piled up like mountains.
They're not hundreds of every page.
It's a high death count. And I'm constantly struck by that bracing historical optimism that you have about this relief from pain. Yes,
I have it because I wrote that book.
Right.
I have it because I researched the 17th century. On the other hand, there are many things in the 18th century that I love, and sometimes I feel like wouldn't it be nice to live in the 18th century and to be able to visit Voltaire?
Okay, for you, it's a bit rough for me.
Right, exactly. Exactly the point. And then also I think about pain, and I'm very happy.
Right.
I don't have to be in this, even in the wonderful 18th century.
Yes.
I wouldn't want that.
Should we open it up? Are you out there? I can hardly see you, but if anyone has any questions, we'd love to hear them. Don't be scared, it's only the 30 Years' War. There's no test. Yes.
I actually will ask a 30 Years' War question.
I think you have to take one of the microphones.
So yes, I will ask a 30 Years' War question, and this goes back a ways. I took a course on the 30 Years' War in Germany, and at the time, I'm not as young as you guys. The text that was assigned was by C.V. Wedgwood. That is, that Germans wrote almost nothing about the 30 Years' War in the post-war era. And some of that had to do with how the Nazis treated the 30 Years' War. But by contrast, when 1618's anniversary rolled around 2 years ago, there was an outpouring, so that probably tripled or doubled or quadrupled what had been written by Germans about the 30 Years' War in this 2-year period. So I'm wondering, to what extent was the sort of the zeitgeist of historians actually deciding to work on the 30 Years' War connected in any way with your interest in the 30 Years' War? Is that just kind of an interesting coincidence that you were drawn to that at the same time, that suddenly German historians seem to be interested in it?
So the anniversary of the 400 Years' War, I cannot blame you if you don't believe me, but that was actually really a coincidence. Because when I start working on something in 2013, I'm not thinking about an anniversary that's going to happen 5 years down the road. But of course, I'm not entirely innocent. So I did meet with my publisher when I was about 3 years into the book, and I said, so I don't know how much longer I will take. And then the publisher said, but it would be nice if we could publish it in that anniversary year. And I said, what anniversary year? And she said, that anniversary year coming up. And I said, oh, I don't care about that. And she said, yeah, I know you don't care about that, but imagine we publish 1 year after. That would also be stupid, no? And I said, yeah, I think it would be. So I had another motivation to actually finish this thing. And it's still actually, after all all the new books, as far as I can tell, that were published about the 30 Years' War, C.V. Wedgwood's book is still the best book about the 30 Years' War. It's a fascinating work of a great historian. And when it was first published, it had to be published under her, Cecily Wedgwood, under her initials, because it was assumed that no one would take it seriously because it was written by a woman. And it's kind of wonderful that it's still, after a lot of other historians went to work, it's still the best one. But it's the interesting thing is that German historians didn't write that much about the 30 Years' War, but German writers did. So, and some of the most important works of German literature are set in the 30 Years' War. Schiller's Wallenstein, and of course Brecht's Mother Courage, right. And then of course you have Grimmelshausen's Simplicissimus, which was actually written. He's the great writer of German Baroque, the great novelist, and he was actually serving in that as a soldier in that war.
Anybody else? Hey.
Yes, hi. Such a privilege to be here with both of you tonight. I'm researching a biography of a political figure who lived in what I like to think of as the 30 Years' War in my context, which is 1914 to 1945. Wow. Mm-hmm. And just thinking of the recent anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau and the Battle of the Bulge. And I was struck by what you said about context, the context that these people lived in. And having grown up with people who lived in my 30 Years' War, I know their context, I think I know it. But how can I adapt that context to biography and, in a sense, memoir? If you could expand on that a little bit, I was really taken by it. Thank you.
I'm not sure I can, because it's a very good question, but I'm not a biographer. I'm baffled by how to write a true life of someone, because I'm a novelist, so I would keep inventing.
Right.
And I mean, I did actually write a historical novel about two quite famous German scientists, Alexander von Humboldt and Carl Friedrich Gauss, and I invented a lot of stuff, including including Humboldt seeing a UFO over the jungle, and I still get letters from people asking me, hopefully, can you tell me the source of that? Because that would be awesome. And I have to write back to them and say that would indeed be awesome, but I invented it. So I'm the wrong person to ask. Maybe.
I am also a professional liar, so it's hard to imagine the fidelity that biography requires. But I do think, just from being a reader of biographies and historical novels, that what Daniel has in abundance is the suppression of self, which is hard to do. I think it's really hard to do in biography, right? Sometimes you read biographies where you can feel the hatred for the subject, which has dawned on them over 12 years of reading about X person. So I think it's an incredibly hard act, biography, because it's hard to suppress yourself. It's really hard. But for me, the kind of historical fiction which works, the kind of attention to history which works, is that which is subject to it, which allows its reality, its truth, which isn't constantly trying to bend it to your desire, your whim, your memories, your argument, all of which is really hard, I think.
Hey. Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to ask, I noticed that in the scenes of violence, I was struck by the way it talks about how each character dies, and it sort of leaves a lot unspoken. So I was wondering what were you considering as you thought about how to portray atrocity and war?
Well, in that first chapter that you heard, the end of the first chapter, I'm trying to do something which I felt was kind of a real narrative transgression, because I have an omniscient narrator who then turns out to be wrong. So, and I did that deliberately to show that side of war. So I have that narrator talking about Martha's future, her husband, her children, and her grandchildren, and of course, when you're used to reading fiction, then you feel like it's an omniscient narrator, and that's what she will have. And then towards the end of the chapter, the narrator tells you that all just dissolved. So she's not going to have that. And I feel, without going into details of brutality and killings, because that's not something that's not something I would want to do, or I would want to, what I would enjoy in writing. That is, again, something that a historian cannot really do, and a novelist can, which is talk about the people who disappeared and their futures disappeared, and they have disappeared without a trace. So they have left the reach of historians.
I find that section so beautiful, and it's so like you, and it's tied closely to your pedantry, because on one hand, most people wouldn't stop to think that when someone dies, you say it in a banal way, all the futures are gone. Yeah. But to think it through, not this child, not the child of that child, not the child. It's true, it's factually the case, it's very pedantic, and it's sublime, because nobody ever says it, nobody thinks of a death in all those lines.
And you have to invent it, because somebody who is forgotten is someone who the historians will not know about, per definition. So that's something that only a writer can, or a fiction writer can do.
It's also describing forms of loss that perhaps we'll never see again, like the form of loss where you die and no one will even ever have known your face or remember it ever. That may be gone now.
Yes.
It doesn't seem to exist, the person who isn't seen at some level.
And the other form of loss also that's less violent, which I do when Tyll's mother leaves the village, and which is in pre-modern times, when you left in a village and you couldn't write and someone left, then that person was as good as dead to you. Why would you ever see that person again? There's no means to get in touch. So, so for any practical reasons and means, from that moment, that person is dead to you. And so that's another thing I'm trying, a less violent form of loss, but it's it has the same amount of reality. And that's, of course, that's another thing that's actually very good about social media, that is not, I can't believe that I'm here talking about social media, but the fact that you do not lose people anymore, maybe it can be a bad thing, but also it's actually great.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. We're almost out. Maybe one more question, if anyone. Yeah, hi.
Hey, how's it going? You guys were talking about how it's kind of a miracle that people can go throughout most of their lives without physical pain. I know, Zadie, you kind of intimated that there's still a lot of like emotional pain due to like a lack of meaning in people's lives that, you know, I guess religion used to provide, but maybe like in our society, it's more like accumulating wealth and resources. And I guess, how do you reconcile the like absence of physical pain that people used to feel with, like, maybe it's more of like a public, it's like more publicly visible emotional pain, like with people being able to share it. But I guess, like, how do you reconcile those two paradigms of pain?
Because it is strange, no matter what Pinker says, people self-report more misery than they've ever self-reported in the history of the world. So something is wrong with the equation.
Yeah, but I still feel pain is an objective reality in a way. So there's a great line in Georg Büchner, the German writer who died very young, which I think it's not in Wozzeck, it's in Danton's Death of Danton, where someone says, if there is pain only in one atom, it rips all of creation and apart. And in
we
a
know
way,
it individually when we have physical pain.
Yeah, and in a way, it's really like I feel it's true. People can have a great life and still think they're in pain, but there's an objective reality to pain, and a more painless world, that is amazing progress. I give a lot of other things for that.
I think maybe just personally what I prefer to Pinker's vision of continual escalation is I think we talked about it before, something like Ballard, J.G. Ballard, when he describes being a child in Shanghai during a violent conflagration, and he walked through the city and it reminded me of you, he felt like the whole of reality looked like a stage set suddenly. And he saw that everything that he had considered the real and the world was temporary, partial, could be destroyed at any moment. Having that thought in mind, that there is an idea of civilization in which improvement happens, but this possibility of disaster is ever present.
Yes.
I think that's the part of Pinker that's missing, but it's the part I find in your work, this kind of almost absurdist knowledge. That's what Ballard thought it was.
I agree.
That horror is very close by.
I agree with that. Even though Pinker, he also does say that there can be huge disasters, but then after that, progress will pick up. And yeah, I'm not sure about that. There can be a disaster to end all future progress. That is, of course, entirely possible.
Daniel's going to be signing upstairs, down at Bernard, just there. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much.